When we look at the gleaming skyscrapers of Shanghai, or the bustling ports of Shenzhen today, it is almost impossible to imagine the China of the mid-20th century. Under the rule of Mao Zedong, who founded the People's Republic in 1949, the nation was a place of deep poverty, ideological fervor, and profound international isolation. Mao's vision was to forge a new socialist man and a powerful communist state, but his methods were often catastrophic. His policies were not designed to integrate with the world economy, but to create a self-reliant agrarian society, insulated from what he saw as corrupting capitalist influences. This period set the stage for everything that was to come, creating a low base from which future growth would seem nothing short of miraculous. Mao's grand experiments left deep and lasting scars on the Chinese people and its economy. The Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958, was an ambitious campaign to rapidly transform China from an agrarian economy into a socialist society through industrialization and collectivization. It forced peasants into large communes and ordered the creation of backyard steel furnaces, which often produced useless metal. The policy was a calamitous failure, leading directly to the Great Chinese Famine, a period in which tens of millions of people perished from starvation. It was one of the deadliest famines in human history, a direct consequence of a top-down policy that ignored basic economic and agricultural realities, leaving the country weaker and more desperate than ever before. Following the disaster of the Great Leap Forward, Mao initiated the Cultural Revolution in 1966 to reassert his authority and purge the country of impure capitalist and traditional elements. This was not an economic policy, but a violent decade-long social upheaval. Young people, organized into the Red Guards, were encouraged to challenge authority figures, including their teachers, parents, and local party leaders. Ancient temples were destroyed, intellectuals were persecuted, and the country was plunged into a state of near anarchy. This period of intense internal chaos further isolated China from the rest of the world and decimated its educational and cultural institutions, leaving a generation without formal schooling and a nation traumatized. By the time of Mao's death in 1976, China was a nation on its knees. It was economically stagnant, technologically backward, and almost entirely cut off from the global community, with diplomatic relations limited to a handful of other communist or developing nations. The average citizen lived a life of scarcity, subject to the rigid controls of the Communist Party. The country's GDP per capita was among the lowest in the world, comparable to that of Zambia. Yet this very state of destitution created a powerful, unspoken desire for change. The failures of the Maoist era, while devastating, inadvertently laid the groundwork for the radical economic transformation that would soon follow. In the early 1970s, while China was still in the throes of the Cultural Revolution, a surprising series of events began to crack the wall of its self-imposed isolation. The United States and China, ideological enemies for over 2 decades, had no formal diplomatic ties. However, both nations saw strategic advantages in opening a dialogue. For the United States, it was a way to gain leverage in its Cold War struggle with the Soviet Union. For China, it was a chance to counter the Soviet threat on its border and break out of its international seclusion. The question was how to initiate contact without causing a major political backlash on either side. The answer, unexpectedly, came from the world of sports. The breakthrough occurred during the 31st World Table Tennis Championships in Nagoya, Japan, in 1971. In a spontaneous gesture of goodwill, American player Glenn Cowan missed his team bus and was offered a ride by the Chinese team. Chinese star player Mao Zedong approached him and presented him with a gift. This small, friendly interaction was captured by journalists and signaled a potential thaw in relations. Chairman Mao, seeing the opportunity, seized upon this moment. He extended an official invitation for the United States table tennis team to visit China. This move, which became known as ping-pong diplomacy, was a brilliant piece of public relations, using a friendly game to pave the way for high-stakes political maneuvering. The American team's visit was a sensation. They were the first group of Americans allowed into China since the Communist Revolution in 1949. Their journey was closely followed by the global media, offering the world its first glimpse into the mysterious Red China. The players were treated as honored guests, touring the Great Wall and interacting with Chinese citizens in carefully orchestrated events. Premier Zhou Enlai famously told the team, you have opened a new chapter in the relations of the American and Chinese people. This seemingly minor sporting exchange had successfully created a friendly atmosphere, making it politically possible for the leaders of both nations to take the next, more significant step. That step came less than a year later, in February 1972, when United States President Richard Nixon made his historic visit to China. The images of Nixon meeting with Mao Zedong and walking along the Great Wall were broadcast around the world, symbolizing a seismic shift in global geopolitics. The visit culminated in the signing of the Shanghai Communique, a landmark agreement in which both nations pledged to work toward the normalization of relations. While full diplomatic ties would not be established for several more years, ping-pong diplomacy and Nixon's visit had successfully ended China's 2 decades of isolation. The door was now open, just a crack, for the ideas and capital that would fuel its future rise. After Mao Zedong's death in 1976, China entered a period of uncertainty and a quiet power struggle. Mao's designated successor, Hua Guofeng, initially sought to continue the policies of the past, but he was soon outmaneuvered by a more pragmatic and resilient leader, Deng Xiaoping. Deng, who had been purged twice during the Mao era, had a vastly different vision for China. He had witnessed the economic stagnation and human suffering caused by rigid ideology, and believed that the Communist Party's survival depended on its ability to deliver economic prosperity to its people. In 1978, Deng consolidated his power and launched his signature policy, Reform and Opening Up, or Gage Kaifang. Deng's philosophy was famously practical, encapsulated in his saying, "It doesn't matter if a cat is black or white, as long as it catches mice." This meant that ideology should take a back seat to practical results. He was not interested in dismantling the Communist Party's political control, but he was determined to overhaul its economic system. He looked abroad for inspiration, particularly to the economic success stories of Asia's 4 tigers: Singapore, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Taiwan. He saw how market-oriented policies and foreign investment had created immense wealth, and he wanted to replicate that success in China, creating what he called a socialism with Chinese characteristics. This was a revolutionary shift from the Maoist doctrine of self-reliance. One of Deng's first and most impactful reforms was in agriculture. He dismantled the collective farming system that had been a cornerstone of Mao's China. Under the new household responsibility system, land was leased to individual families, who were allowed to manage their own plots and sell their surplus produce on the open market after fulfilling a state quota. This simple change had a dramatic and immediate effect. With the freedom to profit from their own labor, farmers' productivity soared. For the first time in decades, food shortages began to disappear, and rural incomes rose sharply. This agricultural success not only ended widespread hunger, but also created a surplus of labor that could be shifted to the burgeoning industrial sector. Deng also understood that China could not modernize on its own. It needed foreign technology, capital, and management expertise. To attract this, he launched the open door policy, a stark reversal of Mao's isolationism. The most daring element of this policy was the creation of special economic zones. These were designated coastal areas where market capitalist policies were permitted, and foreign companies were offered tax incentives to set up factories. The first 4 special economic zones, including the now famous Shenzhen, were established in 1980. They were experiments, fenced-off laboratories for capitalism on Chinese soil, designed to see if the cat of market economics could indeed catch the mouse of prosperity. The special economic zones were the engine of China's economic miracle. Located in coastal areas with easy access to international shipping lanes, these zones were designed to be magnets for foreign capital. Shenzhen, a sleepy fishing village just across the border from the thriving capitalist hub of Hong Kong, was the most prominent example. Deng Xiaoping designated it as a testing ground where foreign companies could operate with unprecedented freedom. They were offered low tax rates, minimal bureaucracy, and access to a vast pool of cheap labor. The goal was to import technology and management skills while generating export earnings, and the experiment was a spectacular success. Within a few short years, Shenzhen and the other special economic zones, Zhuhai, Shantou, and Xiamen, were transformed. Foreign investors, primarily from Hong Kong and Taiwan, poured in, eager to take advantage of the low production costs. Factories sprang up producing textiles, toys, electronics, and other consumer goods for export to the world. Shenzhen's population and economy exploded. This rapid growth proved Deng's theory that market forces, when carefully managed, could deliver astounding results. The success of the initial zones prompted the government to expand the policy. In 1984, 14 more coastal cities were opened to foreign investment, spreading the model of export-led growth up and down China's coastline. The availability of a massive, disciplined, and low-cost labor force was a critical ingredient in this economic boom. Millions of rural workers, freed from the land by agricultural reforms, migrated to the coastal cities in search of factory jobs. They were willing to work long hours for wages that were a fraction of those in developed countries. For multinational corporations, this was an irresistible combination. Companies from the United States, Japan, and Europe began to shift their manufacturing operations to China to lower their costs and increase their profits. In the 1980s, American automakers were among the first to establish joint ventures, followed by a wave of electronics and consumer goods companies. China was rapidly becoming the world's factory. This influx of foreign investment had a profound effect on Chinese society. It created tens of millions of new jobs, lifted huge swaths of the population out of poverty, and exposed the country to new technologies and ideas. However, this rapid industrialization also came at a cost. It led to vast income disparities between the booming coastal regions and the poorer interior provinces. Working conditions in many of the early factories were harsh, and the environment suffered from unchecked industrial pollution. Nevertheless, the economic momentum was undeniable. The special economic zones had ignited a process of urbanization and industrialization on a scale and at a speed never before seen in human history. By the late 1980s, a decade of economic reform had transformed China, but, it had also created new tensions. While many people were enjoying newfound prosperity, others were feeling left behind. The reforms brought not only wealth but also rising inflation, official corruption, and a growing sense of social inequality. More profoundly, the opening to the world had brought in not just economic ideas but political ones as well. Students and intellectuals exposed to Western concepts of democracy and individual liberty began to question the Communist Party's absolute monopoly on power. They saw the economic freedoms of the market and began to demand corresponding political freedoms. These simmering tensions boiled over in the spring of 1989. The death of the reform-minded official Hu Yaobang served as a catalyst for large-scale demonstrations. Students in Beijing began gathering in Tiananmen Square to mourn his passing and to petition the government for change. Their demands were varied, but they centered on calls for greater democracy, freedom of the press, and an end to corruption. The protests quickly grew, attracting support from city workers, intellectuals, and ordinary citizens. At its peak, over 1 million people filled the square in a powerful and peaceful display of popular discontent. The movement spread to other cities across China, presenting the leadership with its most serious political challenge since 1949. The Communist Party leadership was deeply divided on how to respond. Hardliners, including Deng Xiaoping, saw the protests as a direct threat to the party's authority and social stability, fearing a repeat of the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. They viewed the movement as a counter-revolutionary rebellion. Reformist voices within the party, like General Secretary Jiang, advocated for dialogue and compromise with the students. For weeks, the world watched as the protests continued, hoping for a peaceful resolution. However, the hardliners ultimately won the internal debate. In late May, martial law was declared in Beijing, and troops were mobilized on the outskirts of the city. On the night of June 3rd and into the morning of June 4th, the government made its move. Tens of thousands of soldiers, backed by tanks and armored personnel carriers, advanced into the center of Beijing to clear Tiananmen Square. They were met with resistance from unarmed civilians, and the troops opened fire. The crackdown was brutal and bloody. The exact number of casualties remains unknown to this day, as the Chinese government has suppressed all discussion of the event, but estimates range from several hundred to several thousand. The Tiananmen Square massacre sent a clear and chilling message: economic reform would continue, but the Communist Party would not tolerate any challenge to its political power. In the immediate aftermath of the Tiananmen Square crackdown, China faced international condemnation and sanctions. The country seemed poised to retreat back into isolation. However, Deng Xiaoping ensured that the path of economic reform would not be abandoned. He selected Jiang Zemin, the pragmatic mayor of Shanghai, to lead the country forward. Jiang's task was to restore stability, repair international relations, and continue the project of economic modernization. He successfully navigated the post-Tiananmen period, overseeing a new wave of economic growth in the 1990s. Under his leadership, China not only recovered, but accelerated its integration into the global economy, cementing its status as a manufacturing powerhouse. A significant moment during Jiang's tenure was the return of Hong Kong to Chinese sovereignty in 1997, followed by Macau in 1999. These territories had been under British and Portuguese colonial rule, respectively. China negotiated their return under the principle of one country, two systems. This innovative formula promised that Hong Kong and Macau would retain their capitalist economies, legal systems, and a high degree of autonomy for 50 years. The handover of Hong Kong, a global financial center, was a major symbolic victory for Beijing. It also provided a crucial economic boost, as Hong Kong corporations became some of the largest investors in mainland China, further fueling its growth. A cornerstone of Jiang's strategy was to embed China more deeply into the world's economic architecture. This culminated in China's entry into the World Trade Organization in 2001. Joining the WTO was a landmark achievement that required China to commit to a wide range of market-opening reforms, including lowering tariffs and removing trade barriers. Membership supercharged China's export-driven economy, giving it unprecedented access to global markets. In return, the world gained access to China's vast consumer market. This move solidified China's role as the world's factory and triggered a period of explosive GDP growth that would continue for the next decade, lifting hundreds of millions more out of poverty. In 2003, leadership transitioned to Hu Jintao. Hu's era was characterized by a focus on what he termed a scientific outlook on development and a harmonious socialist society. This was a tacit acknowledgement of the growing pains of rapid growth, such as the widening wealth gap and severe environmental damage. While continuing the pro-growth policies of his predecessor, Hu also sought to address these imbalances. His government increased investment in healthcare, education, and social welfare. Externally, Hu's administration was defined by the Go-Out policy, which encouraged Chinese companies to invest abroad, particularly to secure the natural resources needed to fuel China's insatiable industrial machine. Under Hu Jintao's leadership, China's Go-Out policy took on a global dimension, with a particular and strategic focus on the African continent. China's rapidly industrializing economy had an enormous appetite for raw materials: oil, copper, cobalt, iron ore, and Africa possessed these resources in abundance. Chinese leaders embarked on a diplomatic and economic offensive across the continent, offering a different model of partnership than that of Western nations. They presented themselves as partners in development, not former colonial masters, and they adopted a policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. This meant they were willing to do business with all types of governments, including those shunned by the West. China's approach was often transactional and highly effective. Instead of offering aid with political strings attached, China offered infrastructure for resources. Chinese state-owned companies would build roads, railways, dams, government buildings, and sports stadiums in African nations. In exchange, China would secure long-term contracts for raw materials or gain preferential access to mines and oil fields. For many African leaders, this was an attractive proposition. It delivered tangible, visible projects quickly, without the lectures on human rights or democracy that often accompanied Western assistance. By 2009, China had surpassed the United States as Africa's largest trading partner. This relationship was formalized through high-profile events like the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, where Chinese leaders would announce massive loan packages and development funds. For example, in 2009, China offered $10 billion in low-cost loans to Africa, a figure that would grow exponentially in the following years. This state-directed lending, often called checkbook diplomacy, allowed China to build deep political and economic ties across the continent. In return for its investments, China also sought political support on the international stage, including African nations' adherence to the One China policy, which denies Taiwan's sovereignty, and support for Beijing's positions in the United Nations. However, China's engagement in Africa has not been without controversy. Critics in the West have accused Beijing of practicing a new form of colonialism, extracting resources while leaving countries with unsustainable debt. This practice is often referred to as debt trap diplomacy, where China allegedly provides loans it knows a country cannot repay in order to seize strategic assets when it defaults. Furthermore, there have been complaints about Chinese companies importing their own labor instead of creating local jobs, as well as concerns about poor working conditions and environmental standards. Despite these criticisms, China's infrastructure for resources model has fundamentally reshaped Africa's economic landscape and expanded Beijing's global influence. When Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, he inherited a China that was already an economic giant. However, Xi had a vision that was even more ambitious. He wanted to move China from being a major player to being a central actor on the world stage, shaping a new global order with China at its core. He signaled a departure from Deng Xiaoping's cautious foreign policy mantra of hiding our strength and biding our time. Under Xi, China became more assertive, more ambitious, and more vocal about its global aspirations. The centerpiece of this new, confident foreign policy is his signature project, the Belt and Road Initiative. Launched in 2013, the Belt and Road Initiative is one of the most ambitious infrastructure projects in history. It is a modern reimagining of the ancient Silk Road, aiming to connect Asia, Europe, and Africa through a vast network of ports, railways, roads, and pipelines. The Belt refers to the Overland Silk Road economic belt, while the road refers to the 21st century maritime Silk Road. The stated goal is to promote economic connectivity and cooperation, but its strategic implications are immense. The BRI is a vehicle for China to export its industrial capacity, create new markets for its goods, and dramatically expand its geopolitical influence across several continents. The scale of the BRI is breathtaking. China has pledged to invest trillions of dollars in hundreds of projects in over 150 countries. These range from the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, a massive collection of infrastructure projects, to new ports in Sri Lanka and Greece, and railways in East Africa and Southeast Asia. For participating countries, many of which are developing nations with significant infrastructure gaps, the promise of Chinese investment is hard to resist. The BRI offers them a path to modernization and economic growth that they might not otherwise have. However, like China's earlier investments in Africa, the initiative has drawn criticism for creating potential debt traps and for its lack of transparency. Alongside its economic expansion, China under Xi has also undertaken a rapid modernization of its military. Its defense budget has grown significantly, allowing it to develop advanced weapon systems, expand its navy, and project power far beyond its own shores. In 2017, China opened its first-ever overseas military base in Djibouti, strategically located on the Horn of Africa, ostensibly to support anti-piracy missions but also giving it a military foothold in a critical global waterway. China has also become a major arms exporter, often selling weapons on credit to regimes isolated from the West. This military expansion is a clear signal that China intends to back up its economic influence with hard power. As the 2020s dawned, China's seemingly unstoppable rise began to encounter significant headwinds. The first major shock was the COVID-19 pandemic, which originated in the city of Wuhan. Initially, China's strict zero-COVID policy of mass testing and lockdowns appeared successful in containing the virus, drawing a contrast with the chaotic response in many Western nations. However, this draconian approach eventually became an economic liability. The repeated, unpredictable lockdowns crippled supply chains, shuttered businesses, and stunted economic growth. This strict policy, combined with rising labor costs, accelerated a trend of multinational companies moving their manufacturing operations out of China to countries like Vietnam, India, and Mexico. The pandemic also intensified China's rivalry with the United States. Tensions that had been escalating for years, particularly over trade imbalances and intellectual property theft, sharpened into a full-blown trade war. The United States imposed tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese goods, and China retaliated in kind. This economic competition has expanded into a broader strategic rivalry encompassing technology, global influence, and military power. The United States and its allies have sanctioned Chinese tech companies like Huawei, citing national security risks and have become more vocal in their criticism of China's human rights record, particularly its treatment of the Uyghur minority in Xinjiang and its crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong. Internationally, some of China's grand projects have faced setbacks. The Belt and Road Initiative, once hailed as a masterstroke, has been marred by accusations of corruption, environmental damage, and unsustainable debt loads for partner countries. Some projects have stalled or failed, such as an industrial park in Belarus and a proposed canal in Nicaragua. In Africa, espionage scandals and growing resentment over China's economic practices have complicated its relationships. While China's economic clout remains immense, its soft power, its ability to persuade and attract, has been damaged by its increasingly aggressive wolf warrior diplomacy and its political demands on partner nations. Today, on September 15, 2025, China stands at a crossroads. It is, without question, a global superpower, with the world's second-largest economy, a modern military, and vast influence. It has achieved a 4-decade-long economic miracle that has lifted more people out of poverty than at any time in human history. Yet, it faces a complex set of challenges: a slowing economy, a demographic cliff of an aging population, growing international pushback, and internal political tensions. The journey from the impoverished isolation of Mao's rule to the global prominence of Xi's China is a story of astounding transformation. The next chapter, however, will be defined by how this new superpower navigates the intricate challenges of its own success.